Hello, everybody. Welcome to the May 16th instance of the Gateway API Gamma meeting. This meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which in short boils down to be nice, be respectful to everybody. We have an open agenda here for the Gateway API Gamma meeting. The Blaine has already beat me to it, putting the meeting notes in the description. So if you have something you'd like to talk about and present to the community, then feel free to do so. It should be open for you to make edits. Also, as part of on this agenda, please you'd like to make a note for attendance so we can make sure our meeting times are accommodative. So if you would put your name and organization and affiliation there in the attendees list. All right, we've got a couple of backlog topics, but I think we're waiting for certain people to take care of to represent those topics. So we'll skip those for today. The first topic we have on here on our agenda comes from Rob, doing some administrative stuff as far as Gamma timing. Take it away, Rob.
Yeah, thank you. So I know this is actually the first time we've had two Gateway related meetings in the same day, depending on your time zone. So kudos to everyone who's making it to their second one for those that are. We tried out a morning meeting, at least Pacific time morning meeting for Gateway API today. With that said, we were well. Yeah, it did. There was a lot of attendance there. I think it was at least equal to the kind of attendance we get in the afternoon in the later session. So that's great. Maybe we'll need to do that more often. It also seems like, I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but it does seem like maybe we're seeing the same pattern with Gamma, that the earlier meetings are at least slightly more popular. So yeah, interesting. With that said, my main goal, the actual purpose of the agenda was that we're targeting Gateway API v0.8 soon, like in 6 or so weeks soon. And the entire purpose of this release is to have a release that says Gamma is experimental. If other things happen to sneak in, cool. But this is the release for Gamma. So that's why it feels like it's worth bringing up and discussing here. That 6-week target is based on rough estimation, discussion, whatever. If you feel like you need a little bit more or less time, we can, well, probably not less time, but we can work with that. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking about. And with that, I'll hand it back.
So one of the things blocking considering Gamma experimental is this gateway and mesh interaction thing. We're in an interesting situation there. I'm going to try to summarize this extremely quickly because, again, I have a hard stop in 22 minutes. So the summary goes like this. As Mike and I kick things around, we keep coming back to this idea that saying that the recommended behavior is for a gateway-enabled Ingress controller to route to the front side of a service feels like it will preserve the best separation of concerns between the Ingress controller and the mesh, and it feels like it will be the least surprising behavior for various people fulfilling their various roles.
What has implementation problems?
There were some fascinating questions about implementation. We think, and we might be wrong about this, but we think that there are probably a large enough number of Ingress controllers that can route to cluster IPs that this is okay. But then we get to things like the GKE layer 7 load balancer, and Amazon and insert cluster provider of choice here. And we are not sure how big a deal that is for those load balancers. Those load balancers have the interesting property that sidecar-based meshes cannot stick sidecars next to them. So we're kind of at the mercy of the load balancer there. But they also have the interesting property that it feels wrong to say that if you're using a layer 7 load balancer from a cloud provider, then your mesh is just kind of out of commission for any traffic coming through the Ingress controller. So happily, we have Rob on the call who can hopefully answer some of these questions, at least with respect to GKE. And maybe a broader point there is we are 100% going to need to talk to more people than just Rob. I don't know who the correct people to talk to at Amazon are, things like that, but this is an area where we're going to need to figure this out quickly and would like help in doing so.
Yeah, well, I'll say that we also have Liwen on the call, which I guess you're working on something slightly different than this, but still maybe you have some context here. But I'll just throw in my perspective. Maybe I'll take one step back. If we had an L4 load balancer and that L4 load balancer was targeting node ports on nodes on their node port, is that close enough that it's something that mesh can intercept?
So let me describe an existing implementation pattern that I have seen work really, really well. In that existing implementation pattern, you have an L4 load balancer from your cloud provider that targets an Ingress controller in front of the mesh, and all the problems go away, and this works really well. I need to think a little bit about an L4 load balancer going directly to node ports without an Ingress controller. I think it could work, but I need to poke around at that a little bit more. Obviously it will remove the Ingress controller from the picture. And so you don't, you still only have one layer of control, which may or may not be a big deal. Did that
Yeah, that makes
address what you're
sense.
getting at? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of me, I can't speak on behalf of my employer, but from the perspective of me, I will say that it feels like there is tremendous value in load balancing directly to pods without a intermediate hop, which is what node port or sending traffic to a service would do.
Are you saying that from the perspective of the user experience, from the perspective of performance or network engineering, or where do you see the benefit coming in?
And from chat, John is saying that from a user experience perspective.
John is saying this is not the best behavior from a user experience perspective.
All right, maybe clarify which is not.
Maybe I can clarify. I think maybe if we were in a world where every single person had a mesh, then this 2-phase routing would be fine. And that would be a design decision we make. You always do 2 tiers. But in a world where not everyone has mesh, that means sometimes you're in 1 tier, sometimes you're in 2 tier. And I think that is where all the problems arise from a user experience perspective. Now, I also have a lot of implementation concerns, but from a user experience perspective, that's my main concern. So like adopting a mesh would be, it's all very tricky. I think I left a bunch of comments on Mike's doc, but.
I'll also add from user experience perspective, the benefit, like having that ingress, that 2-tiered approach, that's not something you have to manage and scale alongside with your cloud load balancer. And that's not super fun, especially for those customers who are running at scale, because the load balancer is typically transparent to you. You pay to manage that, but if I require an ingress controller now, then suddenly that's going to live in my cluster and I might have to manage that. So being able to load balance directly to pods takes that extra layer out and is actually nice from user experience perspective. So I'm going to throw that out there as well. Continue.
Maybe I should take a step back and ask, what are we hoping that mesh would add in this? And maybe that's a dumb question, but if the options are managed load balancer sends direct to pod, or managed load balancer sends to intermediate thing that mesh intercepts and then sends to pod, what are we hoping that mesh adds in that path? And is it similar in scope to what we're configuring with Gateway API? Like I feel like there's some obvious answers here, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here.
From my perspective, the biggest concern that we run into, talking to people using Linkerd who are also trying to go through and use layer 7 load balancers that we can't put sidecars next to, is you run into things like they cannot participate in MTLS. They lose a fair amount of metrics that Linkerd would otherwise collect. They lose a certain amount of resilience because there are things that we can no longer do with the mesh that we end up not being able to do at the load balancer either. So if you have a load balancer, if you're implementing the Gateway API in the load balancer itself, much of that, I think, becomes less of an issue. The security aspect of it is still an issue there.
Why don't you just add MTLS and let the load balancer do the load balancing?
I'm sorry, say again?
This seems to be, we want mesh to do the load balancing and the security, and the load balancer to do just service selection. Why not just have the mesh only do the MTLS aspect?
That would be a thing to consider.
But you'd also have to configure, maybe I'm understand what you're saying, John, but you'd also have to configure the load balancer to do as well.
You'd have to change the load balancer to do that.
The load balancer would do plain text, and then the sidecar upgrades it to MTLS, right? It's just another workload.
Right now we can't put a sidecar next to a cloud provider's LB.
Oh, for cloud providers, yeah, it's a different story for cloud provider.
And that's where we were starting from, was the cloud provider's LB.
Oh, the cloud provider, if they want security, they have to implement it in the cloud. I mean, you can't add MTLS from the destination. It has to be on the client, right?
Yep.
I mean, we can add it at the very last second and then terminate it again, but it's kind of moot, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, it's a thing that we have to figure out how to do. It's a thing where it's an area where, if we want the mesh to be able to help you with that aspect of security, then we have to have the load balancer able to support interoperability with the mesh on the, as MTLS. I feel like that's a little outside the scope of Gamma right now. Just because we have always kind of considered MTLS to be sort of table stakes for the mesh, and we assume it's configured. So that's an interesting thing to consider. And by the way, don't get me wrong, I would love to see the cloud load balancers interoperating with Linkerd's MTLS. That would be a nice thing from my perspective. I would also love to be able to just stick an stick a Linkerd sidecar next to it. That would also be a great thing, because that would solve all my problems.
Yeah, the more I think about this, the more I think that this is something where we can encourage interoperability with Gateway API. There's absolutely no way we can enforce it. I think, the vast majority of, no, I shouldn't say the vast majority. There are going to be a lot of people that just want cloud managed load balancers from cloud providers to load balance directly to pods. But you can do these kinds of graceful upgrades, potentially including Gateway API, with standardized configuration for a concept like MTLS that may be coming, like that MTLS configuration may be coming from mesh. I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure what that looks like, but maybe we can provide some patterns for how these two can interoperate. And I guess that's the goal. But I think that it
seems like a reasonable goal. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that it's unlikely that people are going to want managed load balancers to, forward to a node port when they have an option to forward directly to a pod. I recognize, greater observability. That's a huge one that you just can't get. MTLS feels like that's a solvable problem with some kind of standard way to configure that. Not sure.
MTLS feels like maybe. Yeah, it feels like it should be solvable. At the same time, key distribution is really interesting. And so that's, going to be, there will be challenges there. But I kind of feel like, and Keith may be about to jump on this one as well. I kind of feel like I'm hunting maybe a better way to get feedback to find out, is this really, do most of the people out there looking at Gamma think that the Cloud LB should just go straight to a pod, even at the expense of a mesh? Or do we want to try to support some of this stuff? Do we want to be able to make that 2-layer thing the common case or not? Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, I think at this point, my 2 cents. There are so many permutations of so many dimensions to this problem. There is the L7 load balancer case, the L4 load balancer case, the L4 is kind of outside the scope of the API, but so sure, L7 load balancer case. There is there's the internal ingress controller to a mesh. There's the Istio case where the internal ingress controller is a part of the mesh.
Probably not just Istio, in fairness.
Yeah, Istio console, Kuma/Kong, I think counts as well. That class of ingress perspective, but then there's also if there's no mesh, there's cloud to direct to pod, there's cloud to service. And
admittedly, when there's no mesh, then Gamma doesn't have anything to worry about.
True, but as far as how the cloud provider, how the cloud provider has to design things, how the spec has to both be able to see, like, in a perfect world, the spec would just be able to, like, if a mesh is present, then do this thing. If mesh present, then if it's not present, don't do this thing. There are a lot of different permutations. Is my point. And different meshes solve this different ways. So to use MTLS and not to try not to go too deep into MTLS, but to use MTLS as an example, with OSM, what we did is we had you could bring your own ingress controller, and the mesh would just create a secret for you to put into your ingress controller that was just going to be your identity. It had an identity for it that you configured, et cetera, et cetera. I think with Istio, you can use OIDC to get a identity and some cert material. There are different ways you could try to do it. And like to John's point in the chat, I don't know that it's fundamental because, back when we were doing OSM stuff, we actually had a design where a new Azure load balancer that folks are working on would be able to read the secret from the cluster to be able to do MTLS from the cloud load balancer to the mesh. So the solutions exist, or the solutions could exist. I know that you want to assume they couldn't. My point is, I wonder if this is one of are we at the point where this is required for people to try this? I
think we need to not be. I think we need to not make it a requirement to solve this problem in order to allow people to try Gamma. That makes me kind of sad because there are ways that I would like something much more standard to improve interoperability and portability. But yeah, it feels like there is enough divergence here that the right thing to do is to move on without it. Mike, you were going to say something?
That's basically a different way of expressing the same conclusion I reached. Like I was gonna still have it, but basically like leave it open-ended of like, it is not possible to be prescriptive and mandate a specific way for this to function.
Well, it's possible, just people would ignore it.
Which doesn't go
Probably
bode
not
well
very
for
friendly, yeah.
spec adoption and implementation and conformance. So yeah, that might be the best possible path forward is we
I think we should, no, go ahead.
yeah, just like I think we have a lot of content in this doc, and we should at least like open it up and make it a gap, possibly remove it from the milestone to not have it block, and know that we are in a period where we will try to figure out what patterns are possible to implement.
Right. Keith, I think you and John
Yeah.
are talking about the same thing in the chat. Rob, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll let this. I think Keith and John probably have more interesting things, so I'll let that be.
No, I think we're just going back and forth over.
Yeah, I think we're on the
Okay.
same page actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So I mean that was the one thing, I guess, just kind of going further on that. It seems like there's probably something there about maybe making that little connection easier. Like, hey, MTLS from cloud load balancer to mesh sidecar or equivalent. Maybe there's a pattern that can be universally applicable. But
be
yeah,
better
I
than
don't
what
think
we
we
have
can
now,
solve
certainly.
everything. Yeah.
The thing that kind of bugs me about leaving it this way, recognizing that, and I don't mean to override what I was saying earlier about, yeah, I think we need to not make this a gate to go forward. But the thing that bugs me about it is that in a lot of ways, what we're saying here is that if you're going to use a cloud load balancer, then the cloud load balancer dictates the terms of routing within your cluster, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that feels a little weird, because what we're basically saying is, yeah, it's going to route directly to not a cluster IP. It's going to route to something that meshes are often going to have a difficult time picking up and doing any sort of advanced routing or advanced features with. That feels problematic. John probably wants to correct me. Go ahead.
No, I think you're right. I just think that I would frame it a different way and say that it's actually the cloud load balancer that's doing it the correct and expected way. And if the mesh was to do a second layer of routing, then that is stretching the definitions of the API and is actually doing the wrong thing. So
that feels very not parallel with the case where you're running a layer 4 load balancer with an ingress controller that's in the mesh. That's in the mesh in the cluster.
I think that probably just works in most cases.
As long as the ingress controller is routing to a cluster IP, it just works. But that is diametrically opposed to what we're saying about the cloud LB. So we've come up with a case where we create a situation where moving between those two might be weirdly difficult. Now,
wait, I don't get it actually. Sorry to interrupt you if you weren't finished. Sorry. So the L4 load balancer, though, it's pointing to the in-cluster ingress. It's not pointing to the back end. You're explicitly saying that the next hop is the ingress gateway. You're not saying I want to go to the user's application and then the ingress like intercepts it transparently and does its own magic transformations.
I think the distinction he's trying to make is from ingress gateway to pod. If the ingress gateway is running in the cluster, some support a cluster IP mode. So instead of sending directly to individual endpoints, they're sending to a cluster IP. But there's no equivalent for
I guess my thinking was that they should just not do that.
If you just do that, you end up kind of neutering a lot of what meshes can do, though. So that feels weird to me.
I mean, what more? I don't know why we expect a mesh to be better at routing than the load balancer at routing.
This
I
is
feel
this
like
is
I
going to
would.
sound this is going to sound horribly petty, but I'm actually bumping up against my hard stop, and so I apologize because I really don't want to make it sound like I just don't want to talk to John anymore.
Yeah, well, just
John,
real
that-
quick before you leave, for what it's worth, my main position is that it's just confusing that when you have a mesh and don't, it's like you have to completely rewrite all your routes. If we were in a world where everyone had it, then I would maybe think differently. So
Yeah,
all.
we should definitely continue talking about that, and I apologize that I have to run. Yeah. All right.
Catherine.
Have a good one. I'll talk to y'all later. Sorry for not having, the solution to world peace and cancer and all that.
So not to try to go too deep while Point's not here, but I've got folks assembled. I feel like where there's agreement is that this is a very complex problem and it's probably not required for answers to this problem are not required for people to be able to play with it. However, I do think that there is, I wonder if we can't push this down a layer of abstraction and say that if you're a mesh, if you're a Gamma compliant mesh, you should have documentation about how you interact with load balancers. Granted, most meshes probably already have that, but maybe that's something we can do to make this. I'm just looking for ideas, but maybe that's.
I don't know if it's really cloud load balancers. Like, I think the edge case is not cloud load balancers. It's these load balancers that are routing to cluster IPs and then having an outbound sidecar. That's the weird behavior, right?
Oh, okay. I see.
In my
There's
opinion.
like
I mean,
four,
it's
there's like
technically
four
like
different models.
there's two different behaviors. You can say which one's the normal one, which one's the weird one. That's your opinion. But
Right.
There's like four different models, and the problem is that we're trying to reconcile all of them. And I think kind of the reality is that there is not a single obvious good way to do that. I think that it makes sense to kind of remove this as a gate from saying that like Gamma is a thing that implementations should be able to like start putting together, and we should like give ourselves the space to figure out what we can do here. And hopefully that leads to patterns emerging in terms of just seeing where multiple implementations are able to find consistency between them. And yeah, I think the documentation thing is like, sure, but it's still like it doesn't get us all the way there. I think kind of like the risk is that whether it's documented or not, the risk is that you end up with configuration for East-West Gateway API that looks similar, but then ends up in different data plane configuration when applied to different meshes. And that makes it difficult to have any kind of like conformance between implementations. So I think that's the risk, and I would like it if eventually we can find some way to at least like express how these things are done, like in a way that is not just implicit or like documented, like actually make it part of the configuration. But I think for now, like we should just accept that there will be some variance and try to unblock the ability for implementations to like start building this.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. It feels like there's been a lot of valuable discussion today that will be very easy to lose context on and then repeat in a few months. And so I don't know if anyone has time, but if we can just, I think it sounds like there's already a doc circulating or something, or maybe just comment on this issue or something just to try to capture this discussion. And
I have a 10-page Google Doc that my goal for basically the end of this week is to get it into a GEP that may or may not merge, but is at least like a place to document this conversation and a lot of the different issues that have come up and been discussed as part of this.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Trying to get it off my plate and yeah, I'll get things unblocked. Keith.
Yeah, so not to get too existential, but we've had several conversations about what is Gamma? Is Gamma a spec that describes the state of how things should be, or is it something that codifies the patterns that exist in meshes today? This feels like a significant step or a milestone in deciding that, or maybe understanding that, because I think, if it were just a question of getting together and figuring out the way we want gateways and meshes to interact, we have enough smart people in here, we can get together and do that. But the reality of adoption and cloud load balancers and ingress controllers, the wide swath of things that are out there, rendered that conversation, well, potentially useful, relatively limited in potential impact. So do we, I feel like after this conversation, I feel like I'm in what's apparent to me is that Gamma as it is today is a spec describing current patterns as it exists today. And the reason why we couldn't get a lot of clarity on this gateway mesh interaction is because too many patterns exist today. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that conclusion or on the question in general?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I agree with that conclusion. I would say that we have accepted GEPs before that just describe the current state of the world without proposing a solution. That may be where this lands. I don't know, because I think there's at least some interest in some small path forward, right? Whether it's just MTLS, maybe it's broader than that, but at least there's something we can do here. So getting a GEP just to explore that seems useful to me.
I would personally would absolutely love to see MTLS when it comes to ingress controllers and load balancers standardized more. There are lots of different ways to go about it, but I think that this is a good group to solve that problem, because I think it makes a lot of the higher level questions easier if we at least have that bedrock done. But so yeah, I think capturing it is important, but recognizing our limitations today is a kind of a reality. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay then. In that case, I believe that is all of our agenda. Any last minute topics people want to bring up? Going once, going twice. All right, in that case, I'll give everybody about 20 minutes back, which would be very nice. As always, great talking to everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks,
See ya.
y'all.
Bye.
Yeah.